Hey, it's Tali, here to tell you about the podcast Israel Story. Now, more than ever, Israel is a tough topic. Some love it, others hate it, but Israel Story offers a nuanced, faithful window into the extraordinary stories of everyday people in Israel. Beautiful and ugly, tragic and inspiring, ridiculous and heartwarming. Check out hundreds of timeless episodes in their back catalog, or dive into the 65 Wartime Diaries episodes capturing slivers of life right now. Hear voices from soldiers to survivors, farmers to rabbis, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and connect with this complicated, amazing place. Hosted by Mishi Harman and produced with the Jerusalem Foundation and the Times of Israel, find Israel Story wherever you get your podcasts.
In need of a good read or just want to keep up with the books everyone's talking about? NPR's Book of the Day podcast gives you today's very best writing in a pocket-sized show. Whether you're looking to engage with the big questions of our times or temporarily escape from them, we've got an author who'll speak to you. Catch today's great books in 15 minutes or less on the Book of the Day podcast, only from NPR.
Welcome to the 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. I'm a book lover and former literary agent who has a special place in my heart for Jewish books. Every week, I ask Jewish authors about 5 books in 5 categories. We'll hear about 2 Jewish books that have impacted the author's Jewish identity. We'll hear about 1 book, not necessarily Jewish, that they think everyone should read, a book that changed their worldview. We'll get a peek into what book the author is reading now, and we'll get to hear about the new book they've just published and how it came about. Today we'll be talking with Jean Meltzer about her new book, Magical Meet Cute. Jean started her career in television, where she won numerous awards, including a Daytime Emmy. She spent 5 years in rabbinical school before her chronic illness forced her to withdraw. Known as the Queen of Jewish Romance, Magical Meet Cute is Jean's 4th novel and tells the story of Faye Kaplan, who after an anti-Semitic incident in her town, may or may not have created her own golem/perfect man. Jean will share how biblical stories find their way into her books.
What I came to realize is how super Jewy I am and how so much of these tales and narratives that I grew up with in Hebrew school, which I hated, wound up becoming like part and parcel of everything I do.
We'll hear what it meant to Jean to read contemporary Jewish romance.
We wanted to see Jewish women who were beautiful and strong. We wanted to see Jewish men who were sexy. These are important things for cultures to see in themselves. And it's kind of sad it took us so long to get here.
And we'll hear about the moment in synagogue which inspired Jean to completely upend her life and career.
The rabbi's giving a speech about Ayecha, which is where God comes down for the first time to speak to man. God is asking all of us, where are you? Where are you right now sitting in these pews? And I realized I was completely lost.
That's all coming up next. Hi, Jean. Thank you so much for joining me today on the 5 Books. I'm really excited to talk to you about this.
I'm so excited to be here as well. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk about Magical Meet Cute. You blend the light and the quite heavy in such a seamless way, and there's so many deep themes going on here, and your storytelling is just masterful. I loved reading it. And what I know of you is also to be someone who's just such an advocate for Jewish joy, and I love that, and I'm excited to talk to you about that too.
Well, thank you, by the way, for those beautiful compliments. I always love hearing that. And you are correct. I always joke, I've been dubbed the Queen of Jewish Romance, but I like to say I am the Queen of Jewish Joy because I am a fierce advocate for joyful storytelling in Jewish literature.
That's awesome. So tell me in your words a little bit how you would describe this book.
I like to joke it's a Jewitch romance. If you know anything about the romance and rom-com world, witch romances are very, very popular. So for me, I wanted to do a Gene Meltzer Jewish spin on this. And so I like to call it a Jewitch romance. And basically my favorite part of this book, or one of my favorite parts, is that for months and months and months, I did research into our folklore and our traditions in order to craft this very real world of this ceramicist potter living in Woodstock, New York. So if you read the book and you see the recipes for the Balador cakes, or you see them doing a divination ritual in a cave, those Balador cakes were in use during Talmudic times for memory. That divination ritual is from 15th century German Jewish community. And as I like to joke, if you maybe want to learn how to craft your own golem, Magical Meet Cute is absolutely the book for you, because you'll learn all about real Jewish magic in this story. But you're right, it also tackles some more difficult topics as well, because how can you write a golem book without talking about anti-Semitism?
Yeah, and I want to delve into that more when we get into it a bit. But tell me how you came to be writing Jewish romance.
Wow. Oh, such a long story for me. So I've been writing my whole life, my whole career. I began in the television world. And this is an important part of my story. I began in television. I went to NYU Tisch, one of the premier film schools for writing. And while I was there, I learned what a high concept idea is. And a high concept idea essentially means that you can sell it to a film as a film in one sentence. So back in the day, boy goes to wizarding school. I started in film. I sort of shifted my path to go into the rabbinate because I wasn't that happy. And unfortunately, I spent 5 years in rabbinical school until the chronic illness I had always lived with since I was young worsened and I had to drop out. So I was in this position. I had a writing background. I had a Jewish background. But I'm still in my 30s. I still wasn't interested in writing Jewish romance. In fact, what happened was I got really, really sick, was about homebound for about 2 years. And I had to make a decision at that point in my life. And that was either I was going to give into my disease and give up, or I was going to find a way to hold on to my joy. So that's what I did. I knew my husband loved me. My family loved me. Even if I was only going to be my husband's disabled wife, even if I would never work again or leave this house again, I was going to find a way to hold on to my joy. So I began sort of like joy hoarding. I, bought a plant, right? I turned off the news. I turned off social media. And in this process of trying to get like emotionally and physically better, I started looking for things that brought me joy. And I started reading romance. And again, romance has this promise of a happy ending. It has a promise of love and connection. And it usually, at least the romance I was reading at the time, was writing to the best of the world, the best of humanity. And again, still, I had not thought ever about writing a Jewish romance. Go back to that Tisch kid who was taught about high concept ideas. High concept ideas looked a certain way. They were not Jewish girls who were chronically disabled. They were Christian white men. And I guess in Jewish literature, a lot of times they were Jewish men, but they were not someone like me. And I had an experience with my 7-year-old niece. She was sitting on my lap one day and she looked up at me with the biggest, cutest eyes. And she said, "Aunt Jeannie, you have a big nose. And big noses are ugly." And it completely broke my heart because, one, I love my nose. Two, no one in my family, we are strong Jewish women. We do not bemoan the size of our nose. And three, she was being raised in a Jewish world. She was being raised in day school, Jewish women, strong, everything. But somehow she internalized this message that there was something wrong with the way and though I did not want to break it to her, she would eventually look. And it really made me sit down. I was 40 years old and I was like, you know what? I've never thought about this before, but maybe I can write a Jewish romance. And it became this sort of meeting place of my life journey, right? So it was the writing and the rabbinical school and the realization that my entire life would have been different if I had grown up with stories where Jewish women and disabled women were heroes of their own narrative. And so I sat down to write a book, The Matz Ball. I did not think it was ever going to go anywhere. I just was writing for her, for me, for my joy, for my health. And what happened was that book kind of just, an agent picked it up in like 2 days. It sold 4 weeks later. And when it published, the hundreds of emails and letters and messages I got about how important that representation was to people set me on this trajectory where I became a fierce advocate for these stories. And so since then, that's what I've been doing. And Magical Meet Cute just continues that tradition of combining love of Judaism, love of Jewish authenticity, and, telling stories where we are the heroes of our own narrative. Or as I like to joke in our book club, we read books where nobody Jewish dies at the end in our Jewish Joy book club.
That's great. That's an amazing, amazing story and so empowering. It's fantastic. I want to hear more about your Jewish identity, your childhood. What was your Jewish life like as a kid?
So I definitely, as Mordecai Kaplan would say, I was someone raised between two cultures. I grew up in South Jersey, outside of Atlantic City. My father was Machmir, right? He was more religious. He had been in yeshiva at one point. I grew up in a kosher home, but I went to public school. And this was South Jersey. We had a decent conservative community, but my experience was mainly public school and secularism. And so I actually grew up feeling very Jewish, too Jewish, thinking that Judaism was being bored in shul. I could barely read Hebrew. So there was a good chunk of my life, this would surprise people, I know, where I wanted absolutely nothing to do with Judaism when I grew up. And I certainly wasn't going to be writing Jewish stories or advocating for Jewish life. So for me, despite the fact that, we had a Jewish library growing up and I went to Hebrew school and Hebrew high school and USY, I was very influenced by my outside culture. And I had a lot of internalized, anti-Semitism about that experience.
It's so interesting. So tell me what changed for you to bring you to rabbinical school to then writing these Jewish novels.
Yeah, so this is the part of the story. So I was very successful, very young in television. I took a job at a Tisch, creating reality television. I sold my first format to Discovery Channel within 6 months, which is kind of unheard of at 22. And within a year, I was nominated and won an Emmy and had a staff of 50 and a daytime show and another show coming. And so I got what I thought I wanted as a teenager, right? I wanted to be a TV producer and I wanted to live in New York and I wanted to have white walls and wood floors and eat, pasta from places like Balducci's. And Judaism was never part of that picture. Like my dad, it was like, I'm going to run away and I'm going to live my life and I'm never looking back. And what happened was I got this list of things that I thought I wanted at a very young age. And I realized I was utterly unhappy. So jokes on me. I go back. It's like Rosh Hashanah. The rabbi's giving a speech about Ayecha, which is where God comes down for the first time to speak to man, Adam and Eve hiding by the bush. And God says, Ayecha, where are you? Right. And the commentators say this is not a story. This is not God asking Adam and Eve, where are you? Because of course God knows where Adam and Eve are, right? God is asking all of us, where are you? Where are you right now sitting in these pews? And I realized I was completely lost. I had spent so much of my life at that point, as young as I was, fighting for my goals and not my values. And it became this turning point in my life where I said, to be happy and going forward, I need to build my house, build my life around my values. And so I'm sitting there next to my father, who we always fought about me going to Hebrew school and all that good stuff. And I realized I want to start learning more about Judaism. And so that's what I did. I started attending a synagogue in my community. I started a young adult group. I was going to classes, and the sort of passion for what Judaism was, it wasn't being met in the States. So I walked into my job where I was very successful, and I quit it, and I boarded a plane to go to Israel in order to study in yeshiva. And from there, I went into the rabbinate. I found this Judaism in Israel that I didn't even know existed in America. That was so vibrant and alive and full of community and beauty. And it's, again, how life goes so full circle. What I try to do, I always say I just try to make things better than I had it. What I try to do is just tell people all the time there are so many ways to be Jewish. It doesn't have to look like how your parents did it. It doesn't have to be the way it used to be. We are a new generation, and we can make this our story.
That's beautiful. I'm curious what you found in Israel that you hadn't seen in America. What was it about that community?
So I can tell you so many amazing stories. I think one of my most meaningful stories, aside from like there is nothing cooler than being with 20 of your friends crammed into a room, eating Shabbos dinner, people dancing on the table, singing together. That is so much fun. I don't care who you are. It is so much fun. But the moment where I began to really see how Judaism could be different was being able to experience different types of synagogues and shul experiences. But it was a mechitza shul, men and women separated, but a woman was leading Torah and reading Torah and leading the services. And I had I had never seen a woman on the bima with such passion, and everybody was like mesmerized by her. And it was, again, this incredible new way to do Judaism, that it came from the deepest parts of your soul. It wasn't just how I was, for my father, it was very halakhic, machmir. You sit there and until you die on Yom Kippur because we're atoning for our sins, right? My sister would say, it's like a competition to him who can survive, who can outlast the Yom Kippur services. But to me, that didn't bring me closer to Judaism. What brought me closer was these moments where I got to see the divinity of the Jewish experience.
Beautiful. Yeah. And so that makes sense to me. I had asked you if there was a book that you read in childhood that impacted your Jewish identity. And you said, not really. No, that there weren't so many Jewish books where you saw yourself.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're hearing this a lot from my age group and authors in my age group who write the type of stories I do, which are Jewish romance, Jewish rom-coms, joyful Jewish fiction, which is that we didn't have these great models. I think someone called what I do and what we're doing second wave Jewish literature. And I thought that was the most brilliant way to describe it I have ever heard. And the idea sort of was that our parents' generations, our grandparents, they were writing these new authors in response to being immigrants or in response to the Holocaust. But my generation, we are now at the third and fourth generation and going down, right? So our experience now, these new authors coming in, are seeking to sort of reclaim that narrative. Not that those narratives should not exist, but saying, you know what, we are more than our trauma. We are more than the bad things that have happened to us. We love, we have sex, we have children, we work in jobs and careers, we have dreams. And these stories deserve the same sort of propping up as our trauma. And so, yeah, I think that comes out of a lot of us felt like, another Holocaust book or another Philip Roth, right? We wanted to see Jewish women who were beautiful and strong. We wanted to see Jewish men who were sexy. These are important things for cultures to see in themselves. And it's kind of sad it took us so long to get here, but we are fighting the good fight to change what used to be a lack of representation of these types of tales.
On Death, Sex, and Money, we feature interviews with you, our community of listeners, getting honest about uncomfortable things.
I developed an illness where it isn't safe for me to drive. A friend once said to me, sex is like air. You don't think about it until you're not getting enough. This is a similar sort of thing if you just replace sex with driving.
Listen to Death, Sex, and Money wherever you get podcasts.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood, the Bible.
So I just happen to think that I cannot remember which literary guy said it, but it was something like the Jewish imagination is always filtered through the lens of our Hebrew Bible, the Torah. And it was not until I wrote the Matzo Ball that I got to see how that book reacted with the broader non-Jewish world that I was like, oh yeah, all the stories of my youth are very much from the Hebrew Bible. The metaphors I use, for example, there's a scene in Matzo Ball, and actually in more than one of my books, where someone gets pushed into a body of water or goes into a body of water and sort of emerges changed. Absolutely, that is mikvah, right? The opening of Matzo Ball is a scene with Rachel Rubenstein Goldblatt, who is this nice Jewish girl of a very famous rabbi, making these little collecting Santa figurines, right? And at the end of the book, she smashes the Santa figurines. Absolutely a callback to the drash about Avraham and the idols. And if you look at my books, all of my books, everything is filtered through the lens of the Torah. And I did not realize how much it came from the Hebrew Bible until I realized some people didn't know that Jacob and Rachel were this great love story. I didn't realize, for example, that I remember my editor, I love her, but she asked which Pharaoh. I had used the metaphor of calling someone Pharaoh. And I was like, what do you mean? And she was like, which Pharaoh? And I was like, no, for Jews, there's only one Pharaoh. There's only one. So it's this very interesting, experience. But yeah, what I came to realize is how super Jewy I am, and how so much of these tales and narratives that I grew up with in Hebrew school, which I hated, wound up becoming part and parcel of everything I do. So one thing I always tell people with these books is really what's so cool about reading this type of fiction is you can see that. You can find that in these Jewish romances and Jewish rom-coms. And you should definitely look for that in my books.
I'm curious if you encountered the 5 books differently in rabbinical school or, in your studies.
So did I encounter them differently? So you study differently in rabbinical school than you do on your own or growing up. So the way you study in rabbinical school, for example, would be you look at the text, Peshat or Drash, you look at what the commentators say. So for example, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, how they build on each other. It adds a certain layer, I like to say. I think some of the best sort of messaging that I have in my books comes from Jewish wisdom and the Jewish world. So for example, Matzo Ball is very much a book about brokenness. And, we are told that God prefers a broken vessel in Judaism. What is other wisdom? Kissing kosher is about sexual dysfunction. And Judaism provides beautiful as a sex positive religion, a great sort of guide in terms of intimacy. And magical meet cute, again, same thing. What sort of studies? The Ramban said witches only practice in caves. In the Talmud, they would argue that all Jewish women were witches. There's reasons for that, but it really, historically, one of the coolest things about writing these books and really trying to do the research to present Judaism correctly is you can see the way even the golem story, for instance, shifted and changed and was taken on by different types of writers to create our sort of broader idea of what a golem is today.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, Once More with Chutzpah by Haley Neal.
So I cried like a baby the time I read Once More with Chutzpah by Haley Neal. And it was a YA book. What was so interesting was Haley Neal writes about a young Jewish woman going on basically a birthright trip. And I could feel the mud on my skin in this book when the character is going into the Dead Sea. I could taste the buttery couscous thingy in the cafeteria when your bus stops midway between wherever for lunch, right? I knew what she was talking about the walk up the snake pit to Masada, right? It is the 7 to 9 day tour that if you've ever visited Israel, no matter whether it's a synagogue group or Birthright or whatever, it is the 7 to 9 day tour that we all take. But I had never read that in a book before. I had never seen such a clear example of what I had experienced written out in that way. And I started crying, not just because there's like a beautiful twist in this middle of this book that will break your heart, but because one, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is the experience people are having with the matzo ball. But two, also realizing that like millions of people are watching, reading books that exemplified their experiences. And I was 40 years old the first time I saw and read a book that was talking about one of my experiences. And so I think, it was incredibly powerful to do that. We talked in the beginning about the books as kids. For me, it was Holocaust fiction, right? Or it was All of a Kind Family. Not taking that away, but it was never based in my reality. It felt like it was happening to someone else, another type of Jewish kid, right? Not a Jewish kid who, wants to go to soccer practice versus Hebrew school, not a Jewish kid who isn't allowed a Christmas decoration when everyone else is having put up lights and go to parties. Like, where was that story? Because that was the story I was living. And so for me, at 40 years old, to see that this story existed and to see it done in such a beautiful way, it's life-changing.
You mentioned in your email to me that you were drawn to the use of language that was familiar, as you put it, to Jewy types. I'm curious to hear more about why that felt so important to you, the language.
So it's so interesting because I go back and forth with my own use of language. I am super Jewy. I always like to say I don't know what people know or don't know. I try to explain things as much as possible because, as I like to remind people, Jews are not necessarily born with the Talmud in one hand and modern Hebrew dictionary in the other. My education growing up was not that good. I had to relearn everything as I got older. So I always try to explain things. But there's also this other side and this new sort of way of doing things where we don't explain things, where we let people either Google it or whatever, ChatGPT it or context, right? And so, for example, someone who does this beautifully and again made me cry was Felicia Grossman in Mary Be My Midnight. She has a line now she writes, if you want Jewish Bridgerton, this is your girl. This is your girl. Felicia Grossman is historical Jewish romance, so sexy, so swoony. But there was a moment in the book, opening pages, where one of the characters says to the other character something along the lines of like, oh, you think you're King Ahasuerus. And I was like, and it was not defined. It was not like to explain, and this is from our Purim story and what this means. Like, I was shocked because it's shocking to see the language of your people, the language of your faith, the language of us who, when we talk to each other, over Passover dinner or at Purim synagogue, right? Reflected in a book. It's crazy to think we have not had this, but why shouldn't we have this? And so, yeah, that was another incredibly powerful moment. And so now I kind of, I haven't for myself made a decision if we should just like write and let people figure it out themselves or if we continue to sort of try to educate. But I am here for both, all of it. Give it to me all.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview, Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston.
Again, I did not feel represented very much growing up in terms of Jewish stories. I did, however, have an absolute obsession with Asian American literature. And things were not the way it is now, where there's much more of these books on the shelves. I remember waiting for the next Amy Tan book, the next Lisa C book, going into the store, like waiting for these books to come out. I related to these books because there was this beautiful sort of compendium, this of women writing about being sort of stuck between two cultures and feeling silenced. And one of the books that I think had a profound impact on me in that way was Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston, which is about a Chinese American woman whose parents are immigrants and how, she feels very stuck between being this American and there's a lot in there about talking too much and you talk silly and I'm going to cut your tongue out, and her mother. And also interwoven through that was these beautiful lessons and traditions from Chinese culture. And for me, because I didn't have books that were doing this for Jewish women, I loved these stories. It was the place where I saw myself the most. And I honestly, this is the truth. I remember when I started with the matzo ball and it was published, and I think people weren't really sure what to do with it because it was so different. But I reminded myself, what makes something not weird is that we just keep putting more of it out there, and then eventually it just becomes part of the canon. So what felt so different and new with my first book, I feel like people now are like, part of the canon. But this idea that you can merge tradition, culture, profound depth and meaning with a well-written, short, fun story has been being done by other cultures beautifully for years. So I would say that is where I've learned how to, in a way, tell my story.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, Love You Alaka by Amanda Elliott.
Go get you Love You Alaka by Amanda Elliott. This is her first Hanukkah romance / rom-com. It is so much more than that, though. It is this beautiful story of a Jewish woman whose Judaism was sort of crafted through sort of her abusive parents. And through the book, she comes to refine and love her Judaism. There's a beautiful romance in it. It's got tons of Hanukkah joy. It is absolutely one of my favorite Jewish romance reads this year. So go and pick that book up, and you can totally tell her I sent you.
Book 5, the author's latest novel, Magical Meet Cute by Jean Meltzer. Okay, I'm excited to talk about Magical Meet Cute. Before we start talking about it, can you explain what a golem is to our listeners who may not be familiar with the story of the golem?
Sure. So in the simplest form, back in the day, a golem was a sort of anthropomorphic creature made out of clay that the rabbis would sort of create to have certain uses. So in the beginning, they were like, you would make this man or woman out of clay and they would be a servant. And then as the story continued forward, it became sort of the way we know it now, which is a defender against anti-Semitism. And historically, there's also been stories that eventually the golem goes berserk or runs amok. But in its simplest form, it is a being crafted from clay that comes to life that has been used for a certain purpose.
And do you remember when you first heard about the idea of a golem or when you first learned about it?
So I don't remember exactly when, but most likely, to tell you the truth, I probably got it from either X-Files or Supernatural, because I love a good genre show, and I believe it was X-Files that had a golem. So I probably heard it from there. But the way I knew the story was kind of how my character Faye knows the story, which is that the golem goes berserk and, winds up hurting the very people who created it and must be put down or destroyed at the end. And what was cool about researching Magical Meet Cute was that, I was able to learn that story isn't exactly the Jewish version of the story. So I was able to reclaim the golem myth in Magical Meet Cute.
Yeah, I had always known it as something that comes to sort of defend the Jewish people and the story of the Alta Nu synagogue in Prague. So I was fascinated by all of the history that you put in with the story of the golem.
Well, I think what's so interesting, like you said, is that, so my favorite part about this is there are actually two golem narratives. And you know how we always say the more things change, the more they stay the same. So in the 19th century, God bless this man, Rabbi Yudel Rosenberg. He was living in Prague, and he was a rabbi. And at the time, the community around him did not read fiction books like Jews do today. If you wanted to write a book, you had to place it as like a Jewish text. It had to have some sort of, I guess, halakhic merit, right? Rabbinic merit. But Rabbi Yudel, bless his soul, as a genre writer, I can appreciate this. All he wanted to do was write this genre of fiction. So Rabbi Yudel did something very, very creative, and he took a story about a golem that was going to be created to defend the Jewish community at that time against like blood libel and anti-Semitism. But he couched it as a found text. You know how there are like found footage movies? He essentially did that. What he did was he wrote a book. I mean, it's so brilliant. And he was like, this story was found in a text in the Maharal of Prague. He makes it sound, the entire thing, like this is just a discovered rabbinic text. And he publishes it. And the Jewish world, they go mad. They love it. It becomes a bestseller within Jewish communities. Now, very important, this golem story is loving. The golem protects the Jewish people. There's no horrible destruction and things like that. What happens then is another man comes along. He's German, and he says this golem story, and he basically appropriates it. He writes a book about the golem, but he makes it that the Jews are like parasites and lepers, and that the golem becomes destructive. Sort of the message of that book is that the Jews will be punished every 33 years for their actions in blood libel, for their actions in magic. That book does not become a bestseller in the Jewish community. It becomes a bestseller in the broader world. And not only does it become a bestseller in the broader world, it goes on to get a movie deal, and it goes on to get written up in the New York Times. 1928, it is written up in the New York Times. It gets a book review. That story is the story that most of us have burned in our brains, that the golem always becomes destructive. But the true story, the real Jewish heart of that story, is in Rabbi Yudel Rosenberg and his version of the golem. So for me, that's the twist of the golem story. Like, there were these two versions of a book. One was a bestseller in the Jewish world. One was a bestseller in the broader world. They were doing completely different things. But the book that got uplifted, the book that left the legacy, was the anti-Semitic book. And the book that was about the Jewish community, written by Jews. Poor Yudel, what a brilliant man. Forgotten. So I gave the dedication to my favorite Jewitches, which were my sisters, but I really, really wanted to dedicate the book to Yudel because I felt like I understood that man on a deep level as an author in 2024. So it's a fascinating story, and going forward, you know, when people talk about the golem, make sure you mention Rabbi Yudel Rosenberg because he definitely deserves to be remembered.
I was so happy to know that history. There's so much in this book about feeling safe, and Faye has suffered abuse, and you take on anti-Semitism. There's a lot about who you can trust and all of that. And you wrote this, you know, you say in your author's note that you were already deep into copy edits by the time 10/7 came around. So I'm curious what drew you to telling this story about what it means to feel safe about anti-Semitism when you did.
So when the Matzo Ball published, I was attacked. So there was a Goodreads downvoting campaign. People were finding me on Instagram and my husband on Twitter and saying things like, I hope you choke in your sleep and die. You're a disgusting, horrible person. All these really not nice things. And it was very shocking to me because here I am. I'm writing a Hanukkah rom-com. I've been a sick and disabled woman for like 10 years. I know anti-Semitism exists, but to see like a coordinated attack was shocking. So I knew from that moment, if my publisher was ever going to let me, I was going to write a book about anti-Semitism. And so when I sort of pitched the idea of doing a Jewitch romance and tying in the golem, I knew, I was like, this is the book where I can tackle anti-Semitism. And so it opens with a papering incident, which is, we've seen so many of those even before October 7th. What also made me become such a fierce advocate was that there was a real strong handful of Jewish authors and even some non-Jewish authors who, in the midst of my own sort of trolling, reached out to me and were very, very supportive. And so that allowed me to just sort of continue forward, because I'm not going to be silenced. No one is going to silence me, and I'm going to work really hard so that no one else gets silenced either. There's enough room on our shelves for all types of stories, and my story belongs there just like everybody else.
I wanted to talk to you about the magic, which I loved, and I was so happy to read in your author's note that all of those cakes and recipes and folklore, that they actually came from Jewish sources. So talk to me a little bit about the Jewitch and creating what that means.
So first thing to know is that there is absolutely a subculture of Jewish community that sort of exists like this. I set this in Woodstock. You should know that when I was a rabbinical student, I worked at Woodstock for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur in their kids programming. And I found, my husband and I, they put us in a beautiful little cabin in the woods. The services were done in these huge 4 tents, right, outside with the nature everywhere. And I mean, it's like the hippie Jews, the Isabella Friedman Jews, right? It is this subculture of a community that does Judaism like in their own way. And so for me, I always try to write from sort of authentic places. So I really wanted to talk about these Jewitches and this sort of subculture of I like to call them the big white kippah Jews, right? It's this community and Jewish world that exists and feels authentic. So I wanted to start her there. I also wanted to sort of talk more about the divine feminine, right? And the way Jewish women were actually sort of religious leaders in their own communities until about the 15th century, when the communities, like broader communities, sought to remove women from this sort of sphere. Also, it's Jewish women, Jewish romance. I love the idea of sort of a coven of Jewitches, your found family. And there was just so much good stuff that is real, that is part of our Jewish tradition, that made this story. And I think what's really cool is when people talk about witch romances or Halloween romances that they put out there, most people don't realize that they're not secular. They are based on a Christian worldview. There's deals with devils and whatever, and like demons and hell. That is not Jewish. We have Satanim, right? But they're Jewish lawyers. We have, our demons are more like tough love, right? They're not trying to drag you to hell. Everything comes from God. So really this idea that we can tell the same type of stories as the broader world, but do it through our lens, and that it makes it so much cooler. That is what gets me excited. So for me, the coolest part about this book is it truly is a Jew-witch romance from our lens.
And was that research that you had done specifically for this book, or was this more things that you were aware of and you wanted to incorporate?
Yeah, absolutely. I did research for this book. Jewitches are not a huge topic in rabbinical school. But I do that with all my books. Kissing Kosher, even intimacy. I took an extra class. I met with the weed rabbis, and I learned about grow gardens. I, attend classes. I open up Sepharia, the greatest online system. So, if that had been there 20 years ago in rabbinical school, I probably would have blasted through in 4 years. But Sepharia is an amazing tool, and you can learn so much. And a lot of times people have already done the work for you in terms of garnering text. So, I'm a Bible nerd. I love this stuff. And I think people, when they read my books, they love learning about this stuff. It's cool. Who doesn't like knowing this?
Absolutely. So for people who are curious to learn more about Jewish magic, do you have any book recommendations for them?
Oh, absolutely. So I can tell you the Golem book where I got the most information from was the Golem Redux. The book that is considered the definitive source on magic, which was written about 60 years ago, is Joshua Trachtenberg's Jewish Magic and Superstition. It is absolutely a great holistic look at the way Jews have been using folklore, tradition, and magic in their own communities for centuries. So definitely pick that one up if you're interested. I will say that's not the easiest book to read. If you are starting your Jewitch interest, that's probably not the easiest one. You have to really sit there with a pen, but that was great. There's also a podcast out there that's called Throwing Shade, Sheyd. That will give you a good overview of sort of Jewish demonology, Jewish folk practices, things like that. And also, I am most people don't know this, a horror movie buff. I would say The Vigil, which is a Jewish horror film about Shomrim, the people who guard the bodies after someone dies before they're buried. It was produced by two Orthodox brothers. That is a great also sort of way of telling a story through a Jewish lens that goes into sort of how a Jewish demon is different. So that's called The Vigil. So that should at least get you started.
Amazing. Great. And talk to me about Jewish Joy. I know you're involved in a bunch of different initiatives, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about those.
Sure. So I just sort of had an idea one day. I was like, there's a lot of groups online. Jewish women talk about books, but they don't really focus on romance or Jewish romance. And a lot of times, the non-romance readers will kind of say not nice things about us, that we're fluff, we're not writing real stuff. So I was like, you know what? Let's just start our own group. So we started a group, and the group started taking off, 2,000 people, almost immediately. And then October 7th happened. And we got even more people post October 7th because so many women were saying, I no longer feel safe in my book club. And I'm like, we need to take this to the next stage. We are now almost 3,000 people. So I turned Jewish Joy from there into a business. And I said, let's start a subscription box, which would be the Jewish Joy box. But I want to be really clear. I never thought I was an entrepreneur. I didn't start this box because I was like, oh, money, money, money. I literally am trying to keep growing this community. Every penny we make right now goes into this community. I do not pay myself a salary. But what I love about these boxes, I talked in the beginning about how I was so sick for 2 years. I was living in Virginia in a 2-bedroom apartment, isolated, no community, no Jewish world. And I'd like to say that these are the boxes that I needed at that time. And so everything in this box is really designed for a Jewish person to open it up, find joy, find community, find spirituality, and find, a place to connect no matter who they are, where they are, college student, disabled woman, Orthodox, Reform. This box is for everybody. I am so passionate about it. And this box gives us the ability to now start having classes in our group, right? So we're going to do rapping classes and women's sexuality classes, and we're holding a virtual Hanukkah bazaar with the coolest guest. And we are actually in negotiations for a Jewish JoyCon in 2026, which will be a huge 5,000 person celebration of Jewish life. And it sounds like, I know it seems crazy because, again, I said I didn't do any of this because I'm like, I'm going to make money. I did this because my community needs it. And this is what, God put me in a position where I have a book and no kids. And so I can do this for my community. And so the hope is that we just keep providing pride and joy and building this beautiful movement based around a shared love of joyful Jewish books.
What a happy note to end on. And what a beautiful book you've written about, just a woman who comes to feel safe in her community, trust herself, trust the people around her. And I hope that spreads out into our real life as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here. There is so much good still to be in the world, but if you need a dose of joy, definitely come over to our light side. We want to have you. So thank you so much, Tali. Thank you so much, 5 Books. This has been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 Books. Our guest today was Jean Meltzer, talking about her joyful new novel, Magical Meet Cute. You can find a link to the book in our show notes. If you enjoyed our show, please be sure to subscribe and share with friends and family. You can find all the books Jean recommended today in our show notes. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Dina Friedman. Special thanks to the Jewish Book Council, Morgan Swift, Jeff Umbro, and Lauren Ween.